Welcome to Think Christian, a faith and pop culture podcast. We think we've got a really good show planned for you, but I don't want to make too many promises. After all, we're not perfect. I'm Josh Larson, editor for thinkchristian.net, your host, and a sinner. That's something that all Christians can say no matter how long we've been a follower of Christ. We're still going to slip up from time to time. My pastor recently gave a sermon. He was talking about our adoption as children of God, and he discussed how even in that state, we can still have a rocky path. In his words, the journey to healing and wholeness is not always straight. There are detours, roadblocks, and axle-breaking potholes. As someone who's hit a few roadblocks, I appreciated that sermon. Now, sometimes we hit those roadblocks privately, and sometimes we do it very publicly. Case in point, DMX. The rapper who passed away last month at the age of 50, he was a man of boldly professed faith who nonetheless led a tumultuous life that even included stints in jail, including at times for literal driving charges. Claude and I are going to discuss DMX's life and legacy and what it might say about something all Christians experience, backsliding. That theme is a bit more symbolic in the Disney Plus series, The Falcon and the Winter Soldier. There, Bucky Barnes, the Hydra assassin turned Avenger, he struggles to fully escape his villainous past. J.R. Forasteros is going to come by to help me dig into that. And yeah, I forgot to mention something at the top, so I probably should now. We're talking about Falcon and the Winter Soldier this way because we believe there's no such thing as secular. See, another screw up. Earl DMX Simmons died last month at the way too young age of 50. He left behind a monumental legacy in the rap world, but also a complicated one, especially for people of faith, I think. As I learned after his death, his life was one of circular struggle, mental health challenges, addiction, intermittent imprisonment for things ranging from tax evasion to assault. At the same time, he led a life of unwavering testimony. Almost all of his albums included a prayer, often confessions and declarations of his enduring love for God, which he clung to throughout everything else. Claude is here to help me learn more about DMX's life and his music. But first, Claude, a confession of my own. I had a somewhat dismissive view of DMX. This was because, as a movie person first, I mostly knew him through his string of early 2000 films. So I'm thinking of like Never Die Alone, Cradle to the Grave. Maybe not the greatest introduction to him as an artist. So I'm hoping you can reframe things for me a little bit. Give us a fuller picture of DMX, Claude, and maybe share a little bit about what his music did mean to you.
Absolutely. Yeah. I also, partook of some of those early 2000 movies for DMX, though that wasn't my entry point into his work as an artist and as a public figure. But yeah, I can understand that. Yeah. So, for me personally, DMX, I can remember the first time I heard one of his early hits, like, Rough Riders Anthem in 1998. Like, I remember where I was. I remember the first time I heard it and just being like, this is so different than what is mainstream and hip hop at that time, especially, in those late 90s. It's a lot of sort of the glitz and the glamour of, Puff Daddy at the time, or Mace, or even some of the, the glitz that Notorious B.I.G. had in some of his hit records as well, even though he had sort of a grimier side to his music also. And then, here comes this artist that has a grit and has an edge and has this sort of affinity for just talking about the harshness of his life, and also just has this visceral nature. And so it was just like, whoa, like, what is this? And they're playing this on the radio. Like, wow, this is crazy. So I remember that, like, in a very definitive and marked way, exactly where I was, AAU tournament in Seattle, like everything about that. And his music became very much kind of an anthem and just a landmark for me at that time and that age. And I think with DMX, I think you describe it really well. He's a blend of a lot of things that we don't normally think can exist in the same kind of person or in the same body of work. And I think that is a major part of his legacy and his impact, is that some of the binaries between the street, church, faith, and honestness, about hedonism, about struggle, about all of these things, they collapse when you step into his music. And in some ways, that confuses people. And in other ways, that introduces people to things that they maybe have never considered before. And so he just kind of opens up possibilities when you step into his music. And some of those possibilities are comforting. Some of those possibilities are, in realities, are really challenging.
And it shouldn't be confusing. I mean, when you think about it, that binary perspective we do have, but if we think about just our own personal lives, they're mixed up in that way too, with struggles, and we have different sides even as committed people of faith. So we like to think of it in those binary terms. That's easier. It's maybe safer. It's maybe that way we can put ourselves on one side of the fence, but that's not, I don't think, reality. And so I do think DMX is helpful, as you're saying, in thinking about that, maybe in not such public terms, but our own personal terms. And so I think he is a helpful figure in within this idea of backsliding. I do, before we get into that a little bit more, I do want to clarify one thing, and this is particularly because addiction was such a big part of his story and his struggle. And so, in no way do I want to imply that someone suffering from addiction is simply making a bad choice when that addiction grabs hold of them again. I think in Christian circles, it can be dangerous to equate relapse as a spiritual failing, in other words, and fail to recognize addiction as a disease as well. So I just kind of want to make that distinction as we proceed here and be clear that we don't mean to do that. It almost seems to me, if you do this addiction as a disease and thinking about it that way, it's almost helpful in some ways for us to see how sin can function somewhat as a disease too. I mean, it is certainly something we have a degree of culpability in, absolutely, that we've made willful choices, but it's also something that we can see that we're helpless before, and something that we're only saved from by God's grace ultimately, not our own efforts. So maybe that is a helpful way to think about it. It's interesting. I was thinking back to an episode of our partner podcast, Groundwork. It's also put out by Reframe Ministries, and a while back they did an episode on, I think it was on faith in general, but they did touch on backsliding. And co-host Dave Bast shared something there that I wanted to bring to our discussion. He said, "When I fall back again, or backslide, or stumble, or fail, or go back to the old sin that I have been doing all my life and keep confessing and keep going back to it, I just have to remind myself where I am. I am not under law, I am under grace. I have been saved by grace. I have died with Christ and come alive. I need to offer myself again to God. I've got nowhere else to go. So if I've sinned and failed, I just want to turn back again to Him and reoffer myself and start again." So I think, along those lines, Claude, you mentioned DMX song to me when we were talking about doing this show that captures a lot of this. Appropriately, it is called Slippin'. So I'd love to hear from you, just what you make of that song in general and how you see it in the context of this idea of backsliding.
Yes, slipping is interesting because even just the language of the refrain, right? I'm slipping, I'm falling. It's this idea of descent, right? This idea of falling, of despair. And the music video for it is kind of considered a classic and played a lot of, on BT at the time of its release and so forth. And I was rewatching it recently. And, I was just even reminded that the song tells his life story. The video sort of does that as well. But there's also parts of the video where, I mean, he's basically in a pit and hands are reaching out, right? And so this idea of descent, as you mentioned, part of his story, addiction, but also just despair, hopelessness, suffering, deep trauma that, as you mentioned, is not always connected, quite often not connected to choices or actions that we have taken. We're often thrust into these things subject to the forces of sin and the sin of others placed upon us. And so Slipping as a song, it's a great introduction. I think if maybe people are listening and are saying, "Oh, I've been hearing a lot about DMX. I don't know much about him." He really narrates the story of his life in a way through the song, beginning with the pain and the trauma of his upbringing, how that hardened him. He speaks about that, the ways in which he stepped into unhealthy ways of dealing with that hurt. And then what I love is that last verse is he speaks of how people around him have helped him step forward and to make good choices and to deal with in healthy ways the pain that he suffered. And so the song begins with to find a meaning in the suffering is where life exists. And so when I think about slipping, I think about how do we deal with the descent and the pull of the pain and the suffering in our own choices that have to be made within that context. And to me, that song captures a lot of sort of internal struggle that DMX faced, that we all face in our own ways, but how much of that struggle he's situated in it outside of choices and forces, even of his own making, and then how we cope with that, which obviously is very much with our own flavors and specifics. That is very much just basic human experience.
Musically, I think in the song in Slippin', there's a real juxtaposition almost between the vulnerability of some of those lyrics, and that gruff vocal delivery that
Yes.
he has. And there's also in Slippin' this nice, I think it's like a synth line in the background, maybe that brings a touch of melancholy too to what he's talking about here. That also contrasts with that gravelly voice. Dustin Markel actually wrote about DMX, a tribute piece for the TC website, thinkchristian.net. And I wanted to quote from that in his description of DMX. Literally barking his rhymes, DMX often expressed more of an affinity for the stray dogs he befriended while living on the streets, hungry, abandoned, and dangerous when pushed. So you've talked a little bit about it in terms of slipping, but I'd love to hear from you just kind of what you make of DMX and his work as a rapper, as a songwriter, how you might describe him, especially for those maybe who are not quite as familiar with his music.
Yeah, I went back and listened to some of my favorite songs from him, and I just have a lot of memories of his music. As I mentioned, the first time I remember hearing Rough Riders anthem, he's well known for that. Well known for a lot of party anthems. In fact, I remember talking with different friends since his passing, and then being like, "Oh, I didn't never really listen to DMX." And then I would just be like, "Ever heard anybody say up in here?" And they're like, "Oh, that song! I didn't know that was DMX." All this stuff
Yep.
that they're playing warm up lines for basketball games,
Oh
right? I mean,
yeah,
if
for
if you
sure.
if you've been to a sporting event in the last 10 years, like you've heard some DMX music and you've heard people, if any of that stuff. And so he has that sort of component to him. But then at the same time, like "Slipping" is a song that helped people sustain when they were in despair. He has a lot of songs like that. And when I think about his music, I just think about the ways that for some people he's a very significant figure of sort of like hope, right, and sort of
Mm,
grit. That like he's continuing to try to hold on. He's
mm.
continuing to try to go forward. And at the same time, you listen to his music and you hear him say particular things, and you say like, man, like this is not a healthy view. This is not
Yeah.
good. And so I think we got to be honest about all of those sort of components to his music and to his legacy. When I think about DMX, I think about the way that he introduced people to different things. I think for a lot of people, his music introduced them to notions of God, Christ, Christianity, and faith. For a lot of people that were not going to hear that in any other place, like you couldn't you couldn't escape that in his music. And so for the people that are coming to him because his passion, his presence wasn't a great lyricist, but the presence and the power, right, reminiscent of Tupac, and just this sense of authenticity. Everything that he spoke about, it felt completely authentic, which is why when he prays, a lot of rappers have prayers at the end of their albums, and when they're done rapping or when they pass away, no one says anything. But there was obviously
Mm.
something deeper and more authentic here with DMX, and so I think he forced people that were coming to his music maybe for the street edge, for the narration, for these sort of anthems of just being hard, being tough, being strong, right? They had to grapple with the aspects of his faith. And for the people that maybe came to his music for other reasons, they had to grapple with, man, this man has been through a lot. What does that mean? And so you couldn't escape those two things with his music. And again, just the collapsing of that binary, helpful in so many ways, raises a lot more questions in other ways. But I think that is a major part of his legacy. And his music reminds me of just sort of the internal struggle of what we experience as Christians, right? The sort of the war that Paul talks about in Romans 7, depending on how you want to read it, right? Between the spirit and the flesh. And when I think about, even backsliding, it's how that battle plays out each day. Right, that's really what is happening. We live in contested space between the kingdom of God and the domain of Satan, sin, and death. But also, we have that kind of contested reality within ourselves. And I think DMX, in so many ways, embodies that musically.
Yeah, holds that tension right there, in his life and in his music, and it's maybe that authenticity you're talking about that is distinctive, that people have recognized something different in those prayers he offered. I think Dustin even mentions that having seen him in concert and, the conclusion of the performance with a prayer just kind of being, shocking, especially, I imagine, as you're saying, to someone who might not expect that or who has seen it from other artists, but maybe it just rang a little bit differently when DMX offered it. Well, I do encourage listeners to check out Dustin's article. Again, it's on the TC website. Really good stuff. I also want to point to something that Catherine Freeman, regular voice here on the podcast, she put together for Christianity Today after DMX's death. It was a remembrance piece, but she talked to various pastors and some scholars about the theology of his life and music. So some great stuff there as well. We'll link to both of those in the show notes. Thank you, Claude, for bringing your wisdom to this conversation. Always good to talk to you.
Yes, always great. Appreciate it.
Hey everyone, John J. Thompson, your in-house DJ here, inviting you to click on over and check out the special Spotify mix I have curated correspond with this episode's theme of Backsliding. You can find it by searching for the Think Christian playlist on Spotify, or just check the links in the emails you get from us or over on the website. Unfortunately, we can't play any of the music here on the YouTube feed, but I've found some great songs that deal with this theme, including Demi Lovato's Dancing with the Devil and the Vigilantes of Love classic Welcome to Struggleville, and a whole lot more. And if you have any ideas of songs I should add, I would love to hear them. What are the tunes that encourage you when you feel your feet slipping on the path? You can tweet at me at John J. Thompson and I will check them out. Until next time, stay strong. Peace.
Josh Larson back with the TC podcast. The Marvel universe continues to expand, as it will, I think, until it swallows us all. Until that point, we wanted to talk about the latest offering on Disney Plus, The Falcon and the Winter Soldier. JR Forasteros is here to help me do that. And maybe you can start, JR, by locating this 6-episode series within the MCU. Where, when, and who have we got here in The Falcon and the Winter Soldier?
Yeah, so folks probably remember that at the end of Avengers Endgame, Steve Rogers went back in time to return all of the Infinity Stones to their rightful place and then just stayed in the past. So there's that great final moment where old man Steve shows up to talk to Sam and Bucky and tell them that basically he's not going to be Captain America anymore. And he hands his shield to Sam, who is the Falcon. And that's it. Like, that's sort of the end. And so now Falcon and the Winter Soldier picks up just, days, weeks, months after that moment where Sam is trying to figure out what it means to carry the shield of Captain America. And he decides that there should never be another Steve Rogers. So he retires it. And that essentially kicks off this whole thing where it's fit really well into Avengers Endgame, because of course in Endgame, they brought back everyone that had been snapped away by Thanos. And so you have a globe that spent 5 years acclimating to the reality that there are now half as many people as there were. And then all of a sudden those people are just brought back. And so, people have moved into new homes, people have moved across borders. And what we're seeing now is that on a global scale, we have a number of political entities who are trying to basically put the world back the way it was, to undo all of the rest of the snap. And so there is a group called the Flag Smashers that is trying to resist that and trying to create this new world without borders, or maybe not say create, maybe say continue the existence of this new world that had existed during the blip, as they call it in the MCU now. And so, of course, Sam and Bucky end up caught up in trying to stop these Flag Smasher group. And all along the way, the question is, should there be a Captain America? If so, who should that person be? They bring in a guy named John Walker, who's Wyatt Russell, who looks just like perfectly dopey in his new Captain America uniform.
He does.
And then there's all that question of, he's not a super soldier. Does Cap need to be a super soldier? There are a lot of themes going on. In the midst of all of that, you have Bucky, the former Winter Soldier, who is deprogrammed, who is free of his Winter Soldier mentality, but he's trying to figure out where he fits in this new world. And is there a place for a Bucky when there's not a Captain America? And what does all of that mean? Given that it was only 6 episodes, there was a tremendous amount going on, both thematically and I think in terms of setting stage for larger MCU, plot.
Of course. I mean, that's always going to be part of it, right? That's the expansion. But this does tackle a ton, as you just nicely laid out. We should give just a couple of the credits, probably. Anthony Mackie, of course, plays Sam. Falcon, Sebastian Stan plays Bucky. And then, Wyatt Russell is John Walker, this subpar Captain America, shall we say. You have to wonder if his casting session was just putting that kind of dopey Captain America mask on his face, and they were like, "You've got it. You're hired." But he's very good in the role overall. The series is directed by a TV veteran, Carrie Scogland. So a ton going on. I think JR in general, I feel like this had more ideas than it knew what to do with them. That was my takeaway. I'll be curious to see what you think, but these really compelling questions it asks: whether America can accept a Black superhero, the moral dilemmas of these refugee resettlements, and how Bucky and Sam are going to fall on the side of that debate. It's all interesting stuff, but I just don't know that this show figured out how to incorporate that into the MCU formula. I really, I was back and forth on it throughout, but that climactic speech Sam gives in the finale kind of really pushed me out. It was just so messy, I felt, in trying to tie all these threads together. And, the MCU has done this. They've been able to pull this off. When you think about something like Black Panther, these really interesting questions explored in a compelling narrative way that fits within the MCU formula. So that was kind of my reaction, but I see some nodding there. I feel like it might have been similar for you.
Yeah, we actually my podcast did an episode on WandaVision a while ago, and we talked about the reality that the Marvel Cinematic Universe does not actually know who is a good guy and who is a bad guy. They know who wears the costumes, but there was a big movement in the wake of Black Panther that a bunch of people were saying, well, Killmonger was right.
Sure. Yep.
And even though he was the villain, like he often was supporting a cause that seemed like the right cause. And I think in this case too, it's really hard to argue with Baron Zemo or with Carly, the leader of the Flag Smashers, that the things that are happening are unjust and evil. And yeah, Marvel, it seems like they try to have their cake and eat it too by saying, well, they might have a good point, but because they resort to violence, that makes them bad. But then their heroes turn around and resort to violence to stop them. So it kind of undercuts, what's going on. So I felt like you. I felt like, I thought the conversation around Sam and whether or not he's going to wield the shield was actually probably handled the best of everything. And again, seeing him as Black Cap and him embracing that for all of the cheese of the different lines that they had in that last episode, I thought was great. I can't wait to see him in a Captain America movie as Black Captain America. I think it's going to be great. But the resolution of the plot as far as, are these people terrorists or not? Should we listen to them or not? Okay, you know what? Let's just punch them all until someone falls down. Typical messy Marvel,
I do hope, I hope Anthony Mackie gets a new costume design as Black Cat, though, because I got very Buzz Lightyear vibes from where he ended up at the end. It was a little boxy and weird stuff going on with the neck. So just
totally agree.
Nitpicky costume design thing. It may be rooted in some comic book design I'm not familiar with, but I don't think it worked for this show. One thread I do think, worked for me, and I was probably most interested in, because it's what we kind of want to explore, was, you already talked about it, Bucky's struggle here. And, what to do with this Winter Soldier past, because, yes, he's been deprogrammed in a sense, but it does keep creeping into his present in interesting ways. I think some of the more interesting episodes gave some time to that, even though he himself has disavowed it. And so it did make for a nice fit with the theme of this show, the idea of backsliding, and just how even if we turn in our lives from something to pursue a life of faith, it's not a flip switching thing necessarily. So I was curious how that might have resonated for you, that element.
I agree with you. I think it was arguably, probably because it was such a simple and straightforward story arc, probably the most compelling. It opens with him essentially in what we could call like an avoidance sort of mentality, which I think any of us who are trying to be changed, to be transformed, to become new, experience this. To use theology terms, this is the legalistic answer, is to do what his therapist did. Give him a bunch of rules and try as hard as you can to live by this new set of standards. The problem is, and anyone who's ever tried to change knows this, if you try to act different without being changed, you're never going to act different forever. and we see that. I mean, it doesn't
Yeah.
take any time at all before Bucky is very much Winter Soldiering all over the bad guys in the episodes. And you see his conflict about it. I thought it was a strange choice, but ultimately an effective one to give him the relationship with the older Japanese man. That he as the Winter Soldier had killed this man's son and now was friends with him. Again, what even that was an avoidant behavior because Bucky was trying to make amends without being completely honest about who he was and why he was there. And so there's still this bracketing aside of and refusing to acknowledge a past. And that part, I think, actually really fit with the dynamics that we were dealing with Sam and trying to embrace the shield, the old black super soldier. Because again, what America often wants to do with our racist history is just pretend it didn't happen. Not acknowledge, not confront, not deal with, but literally consign it to be forgotten, not even put it in a museum, but just much like we saw the old black super soldier, just be forgotten and ignored. And what I think we've been seeing over the last several years is that when we do that, when we try to ignore our past without actually being changed, it just keeps erupting over and over and over because the fundamental rot is still there. And again, in theological terms, that, I think that's what we see Paul talking about in Romans 7, where, we think we can use the law to control sin, but all it does is actually give sin these opportunities to come up and explode and ruin us.
Yeah, there's a scene I wanted to highlight that brings those two things together. Sam's struggle over taking on the shield and then Bucky's struggle with his past. And it does involve that older super soldier who you mentioned. I think it's in episode 2. His name is Isaiah Bradley, played by Carl Lumbly. And the two of them, Bucky and Sam, go to visit him. As you said, he was a former American super soldier, now an old man, but he was exploited and then abandoned by the government, which used him to fight Bucky when Bucky was the Winter Soldier back in the 50s. So there's a really interesting moment where Bucky first introduces Isaiah to Sam.
Isaiah?
Look at you.
This is, Sam. Sam, this is Isaiah. He was a hero. One of the ones that Hydra feared the most, like Steve. We met in 51.
If by met you mean I whooped your ass, then yeah. We heard whispers he was on the peninsula. But everyone they sent after him never came back. So the U.S. military dropped me behind the line to go deal with him. I took half that metal arm in that fight in Goyang, but I see he's managed to grow it back. I just wanted to see if he got the arm back, or if he'd come to kill me.
Not a killer anymore.
You think you can wake up one day and decide who you want to be? It doesn't work like that.
What I like there, JR, is just, Isaiah's recognition that it isn't, a matter of flipping the switch to transform, to just say, okay, I was the bad guy, now I'm the good guy. And thinking about it in these binary terms, which I think we can in terms of our faith too, especially, maybe if you weren't raised in the church, but might have had even a conversion experience, it might be put upon you by others that, okay, now you're this new person and everything will be easy, everything will be changed, but it's a process, one that is going to have setbacks. And so I think that's kind of what Isaiah is hinting at there to Bucky when he mentions that. And I think there are a couple other scenes throughout the series that touch on this. Is when Zemo, as you mentioned, comes back, Daniel Bruhl, Bucky's old rival, and he tries to control him by bringing back those command words. And it doesn't quite work, but how about that moment where Zemo says, something is still in there? I just thought that was a great touch too, recognizing that there's that sinful part of us, to put it again in our terms, is still there, even if we are striving each day to live a life of faith.
Which is exactly where Paul says, I crucify my flesh every day. That continual acknowledgement that to be changed as this continual working out of our salvation, or crucifying of our flesh, or giving ourselves over to that often very unglamorous process of spiritual formation. And, I think one of the most powerful moments for me was early in the season when Bucky finally sort of accidentally says why he's so angry at Sam for giving up the shield. Because he says, if Steve was wrong about you, then maybe he was wrong about me too.
Yeah.
And it's that need that we have in our journey of transformation to have people around us who continually call us to be our better selves. It is so easy, I think, particularly without siblings on the journey with us, to just lose hope and lose faith. And I loved that in that moment, Bucky was very inelegantly calling out for Sam. They can't admit that they love each other and that they are more than just people who had a mutual friend one time.
Yeah.
Until, obviously until the end of the series. But he in a very ugly and honestly selfish way, like, asks for Sam's help. And I thought that was such like a good and true moment for that character.
Yeah, you can really feel, I think Stan is very good there. You really feel his loss. It's this symbolic loss of Captain America, but that moment makes it deeply personal in the way that you just described. So yeah, definitely some nice moments throughout the series, even if overall it might not have worked as well as something like WandaVision for me. Anything else you wanted to touch on about it, though? It did cover so much.
I just want to underscore that for me, as messy as this series was and as clunky as it was in some places, it is about the truth that, you can't unring the bell. I think even Zemo acknowledges in this, unlike what he did in Civil War, you can't put the super soldier serum back in the box. Like, now that there is a Captain America, there's always going to be new things like this. And I think that's important for us too. I think when we sin and when we're trying to be changed, there is a temptation for us to want to try to get back to some kind of mythical, innocent kind of space, or we want to undo the harm that was done. Again, I think on a national level, this is that like make us great again impulse kind of a thing. And I think the show, again, inelegantly and sometimes clumsily, demonstrated that the way forward is not to ignore or to pretend. It's to acknowledge, which again, in theological terms, we would say confess, right? We confess these things, we acknowledge these things. And it's only when we confess them and face them that we can actually truly repent of them. A real and true repentance is not possible when we ignore or diminish or downplay in any way. And I think with Bucky's journey, his stuff at the end, I thought was really powerful, and it showed. We don't know if his relationship with that old Japanese man is ever going to be the same.
Right.
I mean, there may be real consequences to his commitment to move forward. But he, rather than putting his feelings and his desire for a friendship above that man's desire for peace and for closure, he did what was the most loving for this person whose friendship he valued. With the race conversation and what it looks like. I love that when Sam did take up the shield, he acknowledged that there was no decision he could make that was the right decision that would make everyone happy. He made the decision that was right for him and is going to deal with the fallout of that. There were so many examples of what I thought were honest and genuine repentance and confession in the show that I hope that as believers, we can take a lot from that and be inspired for our own approach to spiritual transformation.
Yeah, that's a good word. I think that's probably a good place to leave it. So thank you for jumping on to talk Falcon and Winter Soldier, and we'll do it again soon. Whenever, I don't know. There's going to be a next Marvel miniseries movie.
Loki's coming up, right?
Loki's right around the corner, so maybe we'll do it with that. Thanks so much,
Josh.
JR.
Thank you so much.
Before we wrap up, I want to return to that groundwork episode I referenced earlier, our partner podcast hosted by Dave Bast and Scott Jose. In the podcast episode, Scott had this to say about backsliding. We shouldn't be surprised that faith does have its ups and downs. We are going to have peaks and valleys. You see that in the life of almost every single character in the Bible. the Apostle Peter, Moses, Abraham, David. You can just go right on down the line. They had moments of great spiritual triumph and insight and moments of bad sins, terrible mistakes, told lies, had an adulterous affair, whatever it might be. The path of faith is zigzaggy. We should expect that. And just because you have a season where you feel a little dry, it doesn't mean you are lost. Hopefully there's some encouragement there, and also some encouragement in the life and music of DMX, who in his final days was actually leading Bible studies. Again, Dustin Markell did write about DMX at the TC website, thinkchristian.net. There's also a piece there by Lamar Jackson on Falcon and the Winter Soldier. If you want to make sure not to miss any of our articles, you can subscribe to receive our emails at thinkchristian.net/subscribe. For our YouTube viewers, you missed out on a couple of tracks from John J. Thompson's Spotify playlist that he compiled for this episode. You can find that by searching for the Think Christian playlist on Spotify. Lastly, a quick favor before I sign off. Would you mind leaving a review of the podcast on Apple Podcasts? A star rating would be great, but really a few comments would be fantastic. That helps raise our profile, which is a great way of finding new listeners. The Think Christian podcast is a production of Reframe Ministries, a family of programs designed to help you see your whole life reframed by God's gospel story. Visit reframeministries.org for more info. Our audio engineer and post-production supervisor is John Reeder, and Reframe's co-director overseeing content strategy is Robin Bassett. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in a few weeks to consider how another aspect of our pop culture fandom connects with our faith.